When Cummins learned that Jesse had killed Ed Miller, he decided to kill Jesse. But when he went to the place in Edsville where Jesse was staying, intending to kill him, as he emerged, the leader smelled a rat and wouldn't leave the house. The James Gang's Last Survivor by Donald H. Hale was published in March 1969 by The West magazine. Author's note: in some bank vault, or in some collector's hands, there is perhaps an old manuscript written by the last survivor of the famous Jesse James outlaw band. This man was Jim Cummins, who died on July 9th, 1929, in a Missouri Confederate's home near Higginsville, Missouri. His manuscript is supposed to expose the famous Jesse and Frank James and to change their image, according to Cummins. He said it would tell all. And Cummins did tell much about himself and his association with the James boys during his lifetime. He was interviewed several times while living at the home and told the story of his life during the Civil War and of the personalities of the James brothers. Here is that story in his own words as it was told to interviewers. Frank and Jesse James and I were born and raised together in the same neighborhood. I knew their mother, a regular she-devil was she, and I had been in their home many a time. We went to the same school, we played together, and strange as it may seem, we went to the church together to hear the old Baptist preacher. One evening, when I was a boy, I was coming home from cutting timber, and I neared the house. I heard loud talking and cursing. I peeked around the corner of the house, and there were 5 of Bigelow's men in militia uniform, cursing and abusing my mother because she had nothing left for them to steal, because she had 2 sons in the Confederate Army, and for being a rebel herself. One of them, whose name I have never learned, drew back his fist to hit Mother, cursing and abusing her all the time. I first began to carry a gun when I was about 13 years old. Anyway, I carried it for many years. I loved it, practiced with it, and I was a good shot. After the border troubles started, I carried it with me always. I had it with me when I turned the corner that evening, and I'm thankful to God that I did have it, because it enabled me to send that fellow who was threatening to strike my mother to hell in a hurry. That was one of the good acts of my life. When he fell to the ground, the others with him reached for their revolvers. I killed 3 of them altogether and broke the arm of a 4th. He and the 5th rode away and escaped. I found an order signed by Bigelow directing them to go to the home of Samuel R. Cummins, my father, and commandeer livestock and provisions. Mother urged me to leave at once, as others would come to kill me, so that night I left home, never again to see the old place as it was then. I crossed the Missouri River and served for a while under the Prince of Gallant Soldiers, Joseph O. Shelby, and when I was 17 years old, I was mustered into the regular Confederate service by Colonel Calhoun Thornton at the home of my uncle Robert Farrell in Clay County. This cost the life of my uncle. Bigelow hung him, and to show his contempt of him, would not allow his body to be buried, but left it hanging. Finally, our Negroes cut it down and buried it. This is a fair sample of life on the border in those days. However, I had the supreme pleasure of being one of a party that went to the home of Captain Bigelow in 1864 to arrest him and his brother, and as they resisted arrest, we killed them both, shot them, which was a shame, as they should have been hung. I was in on the raid on Lawrence. Quantrell was a well-educated man of great personality, very handsome, looking more like a minister than an outlaw. This refined man was one of the coolest and most determined men I had ever saw in action. He did not know what fear was, and in action he had a heart of stone. He was never a fearful man. On this particular day, Frank James seemed to have a habit of taking cover at every opportunity. I don't think there was a man in the detachment that could find as many safe places to fire from as could Frank James. After the war was over, I tried to return to my home. I was accused of being an outlaw, and I had to hide out. In February 1866, I received a note from Frank James to meet him in Liberty, Missouri on the 14th. I was in Jackson County at the time, working on a farm near Lee's Summit. When I got to Liberty, I hid around the best I could, waiting for them to show up. I did not know what they wanted. In a few minutes, I heard a shot fired and running out on the street, and I saw Frank and Jesse coming out of the bank with guns in their hands. Clell Miller had a sack in one hand and a gun in the other, and as they ran to their horses, a young man named Wymore, about 16 years of age, on the other side of the street stopped to see what was going on. Frank James shot and killed the Wymore boy, who was unarmed and little more than a child. Frank then saw me standing on the street, and he called to me, saying, "Come on, Cummins," and from that day on, I became an outlaw in the minds of many people. This book of mine is not to be seen by anyone until after I'm dead, but I am writing it so that the truth about the James gang may be known at last. The truth has never been told. I am going to tell it, and tell it all. I daren't tell the truth while I'm alive. They'd lock me up if I did. Why, I know things that I could get $5,000 a day for telling, but it wouldn't be healthy for me if I told. When I'm dead, they can't hurt me. Another reason I want to write the book, I want to tear the masks off of Frank and Jesse James, who were posing as heroes. Bah, they were just common, ordinary robbers, traitors, and double-crossers. Heroes, not on your life. And I know. I rode with them. I camped with them. Slept with them. Went into the jaws of death and the fumes of hell with them. I knew Frank and Jesse James better than any man that ever lived. And to tell you, they were just plain robbing crooks without honor. Frank James posed for years as the best of the two. After Jesse was killed, Frank went on a permanent exhibition as a race starter at fairs, as doorkeeper of the toughest theater in St. Louis, posing as the victim of his brother, Jesse. He let the whole world say and believe that Jesse was the worst of the two. He never opened his mouth to correct it. I knew them, and I tell you that both of them were bad enough, but Jesse was the better of the two bad men of that ill-starred family. I remember one time after the Glendale train robbery near Kansas City in 1879, Jesse James, Dick Little, Bill Ryan, and myself crossed the river at Leavenworth and rode down to Nashville, and I went out to see Frank James, who lived near there. Frank kicked because Jesse had brought Bill Ryan with him, and Frank said to me, "Jim, you're welcome at my house at any time, but you go over to Nashville and tell Dingus not to bring that damned Irishman here." Frank always called Jesse Dingus. When I told this to Jesse, he became all riled up and threatened to kill Frank. The next day, Jesse hired a buggy, and he and his wife and Bill Ryan drove out to Frank's house and spent the day there. Jesse tried every way that day to pick a quarrel with his brother Frank so he could kill him, but Frank knew what he was after and managed to keep the peace. Jesse had murder in his heart that day, and when he saw that he couldn't pick a row with Frank, he quarreled with Dick Little and drew his revolver, and he would have killed Dick, but I stepped in between them and prevented it. Jesse told me that day he believed his brother, Frank, wanted to kill him. And Jesse said that if he was dead and out of the way, Frank would then surrender and ask a pardon on the plea that Jesse was the real bad man of the two and did most of the robbing and killing. And sure enough, not long after Jesse was killed, Frank did surrender and did contend that Jesse and I were responsible for most of the robberies. Talk about Frank James being a hero. If Frank had been the right kind of a man, he would have avenged the death of his brother Jesse. He would have never rested until he had killed Bob and Charlie Ford. If they had killed Frank, you bet your life that Jesse would have killed them both. But Frank was intent only on saving his own bacon. Now I'm going to tell you the inside facts in my book. I'm going to tell the truth about the part Jesse and Frank James took in the Northfield bank robbery in Minnesota. The men in the robbery were Frank and Jesse James, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, and Bill Chadwell. Frank James always denied that he was in that raid and insinuated that I was in it. But I know who was there. They all met in Kansas City and planned the raid. Then they went over to the home of Mrs. Samuels, mother of the James boys, in Clay County, and from there they rode to Northfield. Miller, Pitts, and Chadwell were killed outright in a street fight of the bank. The others got away and hid in the timber in a creek bottom. They pretended to be fishermen. Cole Younger foraged out and got a couple of horses, but his brother Bob was wounded and he couldn't ride, and Cole wouldn't leave him. Jesse wanted to kill Bob and leave him, as he would hinder their escape. Jesse and Cole quarreled, and Jesse and Frank took the two horses and rode off. They barely got away across a bridge as the posse came up, which captured the Youngers. Jesse and Frank had a hard time getting away. Once they rode for miles in the covered wagon of a sewing machine man. They returned home by roundabout way that took them out through Arizona and New Mexico. They nearly starved. They ate raw rabbits and roots. They finally got back to Clay County, and from there they got away to Kentucky. Tyler Burns drove Frank James's wife in the covered wagon, and Frank rode on horseback. When they came to a town, Burns would drive through, and Frank would ride around the town and join them beyond it. Jesse James and his wife went in the same way, and the wagon being driven by Johnny Samuels. After they got down in southern Missouri, the two parties joined company, but Frank and Jesse had a violent quarrel, and they separated there. After Jesse James and I had been together for years, facing death together, we fell out, and I tried to kill him, and he tried to kill me, and our quarrel was over the murder of my friend Ed Miller. Miller was with Jesse James in the Glendale train robbery in Jackson County in 1879, and at that time Frank James was living under the name of Ben Woodson on the Pike Road, 3 miles from Nashville, Tennessee. Jesse James's wife was boarding in Nashville. Jesse got a lot of money in the Glendale robbery, and Jesse and Ed Miller bought a racehorse, Jim Malone, and took him around to different race meets, but went broke on him. Meantime, Tucker Basham had been arrested for the Glendale robbery and turned state's evidence and told that I and Jesse, Ed Miller, Bill Ryan, and Dick Little were in the robbery. Of course he lied about me. I was not in it. Neither was Frank James. After Jesse and Ed Miller went broke on their racehorse, they started back for Missouri on horseback. Near Norborn, Missouri, Jesse James killed Ed Miller and took his watch and horse and rode on to Charlie Ford's in Ray County, and then on to the home of Mose Miller, Ed's brother, and told him Ed was sick and likely to die, and Jesse presented to Mose Miller a forged order for $375 signed by Ed Miller, and Mose paid Jesse the money. Jesse disposed of the watch. The body of Ed Miller was buried by Sam Burton, who found it very badly decomposed. That's the kind of hero Jesse James was, murdering his comrade and robbing his body, and for what? I learned finally that Jesse had killed Ed Miller, and I decided to kill Jesse. I went to a house where he was stopping at Edsville, Kentucky, and asked Jesse to come out and look at a horse. I intended to kill him as he came out the door, but he smelled a rat and he wouldn't come. He said he would see the horse in the morning. I told him he had killed Ed Miller and that I intended to let Miller's friends in Missouri know all about it. And I did that, and Jesse James did not live long afterwards. I never spoke to Jesse James after that night. I was his enemy, and he was my enemy. He tried to get me killed, and came to the home of William Ford, my brother-in-law, to kill me himself. I was offered $5,000 in cash by the authorities if I would give information that would lead them to the capture of Jesse James, and I could have gotten the money easily, but no one can put the brand of traitor on me. I wouldn't have surrendered him for $1 million. I despise and hate the way he was killed, but still, it was a traitor against a traitor. Jesse James as much of a traitor as Bob Ford, and he got what he deserved for killing Ed Miller. But still, I think that Jesse was more honorable than Frank, at least at that. After Jesse's death, all the robberies and killings were laid at his door by Frank James and his friends. In my book, I'll tell who killed Witcher, the Pinkerton detective, and who murdered Westfall, the Rock Island conductor, and McMillan, the old man in the train robbery at Winston, Missouri in 1881. Frank James was tried for that murder and acquitted. He said I was the man that in that robbery who resembled him. I deny it. I say Frank James was in that robbery. It was done by Frank James and Jesse James, Wood and Clarence Height and Dick Little. I was working at the time in the harvest field at Gorham, Russell County, Kansas, for $1.50 a day. I was there when Jesse James was killed, and from there I went to Buffalo, Wyoming, and opened a shoe store and stayed there until I came back to Missouri and surrendered. Author's note. Although Cummins had a book published in 1903 at Denver, Colorado, entitled Jim Cummins' Book, written by himself, this other completed manuscript, unpublished manuscript, was at the time of his death in 1929 in a bank vault in Kansas City, Missouri. What became of the manuscript? I'm sure someone living today knows. but I'm beginning to wonder if anybody else will ever find out.